One of the most challenging parts of looking at history is to look at it honestly, because we have filters, and it's called our own experience. And so we have certain things that we value. Maybe it's altar calls, maybe it's worship, maybe it's on the street evangelism, whatever it might be. We have things that we value, and they become our filters, and we interpret past moves of God through what we value. What we miss is every move of God creates an offense in the church where people have to make an adjustment to what God is now doing. He will always include something from the past, but he'll always start something new that's not acceptable. And that process of getting over offense and learning to recognize where the cloud is moving, learning history. For example, every move of God presents something new that's offensive. Early 1900s, it was speaking in tongues. It's existed all through church history, but it came to the forefront, and it caused many people to reject the move of God because something new was brought into the equation. You get to the late 40s, you have a whole nother branch of things. The emphasis on healing or the emphasis on the prophetic caused many people to rise up in offense. Well, this guy got the prophecy wrong and caused these people to stumble, and so they would reject the whole thing. Every move of God presents something new that's offensive. Over time, the church settles into the practice. In Redding, when my dad started emphasizing worship here 40-some years ago, it was not accepted. But he pressed in. Now the very groups that would criticize him for what he was doing, those groups are practicing the very thing. Truth lasts longer than opponents do. I'm going to start preaching tomorrow's message if I'm not careful. Honestly, if we can learn from history what they struggled with as well as what they took risk on and succeeded in, if we can keep an honest approach to history, we'll be much better equipped to face what God's about to do, because he's about to dial us up in ways we're not used to. You know, many of you were here 20 years, 25 years ago when the Lord brought some new things to us that we weren't all that comfortable with, but a number of people said, we don't care, whatever he's doing, we want it. That hurdle is what enabled us to succeed, to be honest. And so I don't know if that helps. An honest look at history. You look at the heroes of the faith, the Charles Finneys, the Smith Wigglesworth, the Whitfield and Wesleys, and every one of those guys had equally famous people opposing them. Every one of them. They had opponents that were equally famous. We don't know their names today, but in their day, they were as scrutinized and criticized and publicly opposed by equally famous people. Wow. But truth lasts longer. And the Lord doesn't always reward the person in their generation, but he rewards them from eternity for holding fast to what God is saying and doing.
So good.
The opponent's name disappears in history. You can find them. I have a list somewhere. Just because I wanted to come to that realization that to approach history honestly, Wesley was very famous, but there were other people who were equally famous that would criticize, oppose, and you go all through the names of the people that you might like. They had opponents that were equally famous, but their names are forgotten. And, my approach is I want my name known in heaven and in hell. So anywhere else is a bonus. So. Yeah.
Well, that was profound. I think there's a verse in Hebrews that says, therefore, leaving the elementary teachings of Christ, let us press on to maturity. And then he lists 6 elementary teachings, like resurrection from the dead. Kind of important. And of course, if you read the words without the context, which happens to us constantly, you could think the Hebrew writer is saying those things are no longer important. But what he's saying is that those things are in your foundation, now build something on them. What I find is if you forget your history, that you don't have a value for what you're living in. I wrote a blog the other day that probably should have been done more gracefully. I did it at 3 a.m. I thought through how wise that was afterwards. But I still think it's absolutely true, and that is that, as an example, socialism is slowly being embraced because we have people who were born for the first time without a draft and without a world war. And also our great-grandfathers who fought in those wars and who lived through the Depression, they're mostly gone. So that voice and that sacrifice is slowly being forgotten, which in some ways is good, of course. But the sad thing is that if you don't know what it costs to get you here, then you have no value for the sacrifice of it. And I love John Maxwell's statement. He was probably quoting someone else because there's a lot of quotes in his book. But in his book, he wrote, "Don't take down the fence till you know why someone built it." So I think the danger of a progressive move of God is that you can forget what's in the foundation of it and then have no value for it. And that's when history, in a negative way, repeats itself because you didn't take care of the things that actually got you here because, one, you didn't know they got you here, or, you can look at my Facebook page. It's very interesting. It's very healthy for me to read through the comments of, some people are very rude, but I'm like, I understand. I get a better understanding of war's terrible. We don't want your values and I'm like, yeah, war wasn't a choice. Like we would be speaking German right now if we didn't. Our forefathers didn't say, hey, let's have a war. Like they had the same resistance we have to war, but they were willing to pay a price for freedom. And so I think the same thing happens in the values we have and the price we're paying for the influence that we have in cities. We're learning. We're making tons of mistakes every day, and we're pioneers. And someone will be a settler. Like we are messy people, but our children and our grandchildren, they will build something on it. And my goal, I'm keeping one of my grandsons is very interested in cultural transformation or reformation, as we chose to call it. This taking of cities, not the kingdom coming in cities and in culture, and what's it look like? And he is just passionate about it, and he's with me in every meeting. He wants to be in every meeting I'm in, and I'm like, and I felt the other day, I'm like, you're not ready to be in these meetings, and I felt the Lord say, he needs to know the history so that he carries it into the next generation. And so I think those things are really, really important, and I feel like we have Bill has taught us, and Bill's father taught us the value of those who went before us, and having a multi-generational revival is the only thing we've ever wanted. We need the elderly with us to remind us of the foundations that we're building this beautiful building, and the foundation is almost never beautiful, but more essential than what we're building. And so I think those things are super important, that we understand the sacrifices that people that went before us and the mistakes they made, so we don't reproduce those mistakes. People want to remind us that George Washington had slaves and those things, and those are we don't want to repeat those mistakes, but we certainly want the things that our forefathers, the courage and the wisdom that they had moving forward. There's no such thing as a perfect person in history. And there were things that in the evolution of godliness that we're learning today, and we look back and we're like, oh, how did our forefathers keep slaves? What a terrible thing. But they thought about it differently in those days. And those things, and sometimes we discard history because they did something that was wrong. And I'm like, oh, they did a whole bunch of really right things too. And somehow we have to not look at history through our offenses.